There is a place deep in the ocean where pressure is 1,000 times stronger than that we're used to at the surface. This force is enough to turn an unprotected human into dust instantly. Well, maybe more like mud. Anyway, that's why explorers need some serious preparation and equipment to survive in such extreme conditions down in the Mariana Trench. It is as wide as 20 national malls in Washington, D.C., and about 1/5 as long as the diameter of Earth. People who went all the way down describe it as a chilly, quiet, and very peaceful place. They saw a bright blanket of red and yellow rocky outcrops, and there was a whole variety of unique, small, translucent animals. The popular myth is that more people have gone to the moon than to this deepest place on Earth is not true, though. In total, 24 humans flew to the moon, and at least 27 brave souls dove down to the Mariana Trench. Most of them were explorers and not proper scientists. They just go there for the thrills and also to collect video evidence of different wildlife, geological formations, and human-made objects. Humans started traveling around space and into the ocean depths at around the same time. The first moon landing was in 1969. And the first person to go down the Challenger Deep, the deepest part of the Mariana Trench, did so in 1960. This unusual location got its name after the British ship HMS Challenger, which first located this massive drop in the ocean floor at the end of the 19th century. It would take 8 more decades before the first human went down to it. Explorers didn't manage to do it in a conventional submarine. They used a type of submersible called a bathyscaphe. The Swiss oceanographer Auguste Piccard designed his own in 1953. 7 years later, the submersible managed to do the impossible. It had reached a depth of nearly 36,000 feet. But what explorers saw was merely a fraction of the trench's full size. The fact that it is so huge of the Mariana Trench is just one of the reasons why it's mostly unexplored today. The absence of light is another major issue. Sunlight is incapable of reaching such profound depths, so the entire trench from top to bottom lies in absolute darkness. Because of such conditions, the ecosystem is a lot different than the shallower regions of the Pacific. This puts immense pressure on marine wildlife. Yeah, the pun is intended. Another reason why it's so challenging to survive there is the temperature. Water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. At the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the ocean is just a couple of degrees above freezing. One of the factors that hasn't let this area turn into a giant icicle is the fact that salt water has a slightly lower freezing point. The other reason is geothermal energy that warms the ground at the bottom of these just enough for it not to freeze. That's why submersibles need to have proper insulation to navigate these icy conditions. When they reach the bottom, researchers find out that this desolate and harsh climate is home to several animal species. They encountered arrow-toothed eels, snailfish, and spoonworms at various depths. There were even strange-looking translucent sea cucumbers and shrimp-like amphipods. The biggest surprise was microbial mats thriving on methane and hydrogen from the mud. Among the species, the Mariana snailfish looks like a master of the environment that can go farther and deeper into the trench to feed on prey than its competitors. Despite its seemingly fragile appearance, the snailfish has adapted to withstand extreme pressures, a superpower it wouldn't be able to survive without. The exotic life forms that live deep down aren't normal-sized, since deep-sea gigantism makes them grow significantly larger than their counterparts in other ecosystems. One example is the giant tube worm, which can be 6 feet long. Science has a hard time explaining the exact cause of this form of gigantism. Thermal vents are just one of the possible explanations. All of these factors might help explain the huge time gap in researching the Mariana Trench. The first successful dive after the 1960 expedition came only in 2012. That's when the famous Canadian film director James Cameron went down in the deep-sea Challenger. Because few scientists have gone that deep before or after Cameron, There is no map of the deepest point on our planet. We know very little about the oceans that cover 2/3 of the Earth's surface. Researchers have mapped out only 5% of them so far. Science still has a lot to discover in the Mariana Trench and other unexplored places on our planet. The Amazon rainforest stands as the best example of the world's most unexplored regions. The list of reasons why this part of South America is unknown starts with its wildlife: jaguars, anacondas, piranhas, black caimans, and Brazilian wandering spiders are just some of the creatures that pose a risk for researchers. Relentless year-round rainfall induces heavy flooding. Add to all this some treacherous river currents, and you can see why scientists have mapped such a small percentage of the Amazon to date. In just one region of Brazil, near Peru, there are at least 14 tribes that have never had contact with the outside world. The national authorities intend to keep it that way. Isolation of these indigenous people is the best way to protect their future. The same goes for a remote island in the Indian Ocean. After the tragic tsunami of 2004, helicopters flew over North Sentinel Island to make sure its inhabitants were alive and well. Meanwhile, the Sentinelese weren't thrilled. They took up bows and arrows to drive away the unwanted visitors. This tribe is one of the last uncontacted tribes on Earth. Although anthropologists and filmmakers visited the island in the late 1960s, we still don't know much about its indigenous population. It sits a long way off any shipping lanes in the Bay of Bengal. North Sentinel has no natural harbor, and it's surrounded by a shallow reef. This makes access to the island possible only by boat. The Indian officials who lay claim to the island have prohibited outsiders from visiting the island for safety reasons. The estimates on how many people inhabit the island vary significantly, from as few as 15 to as many as 500. The island is not tiny. It's about 5 times as big as London's Heathrow Airport. Apart from occasional contact during the past 2 centuries, the Sentinelese must have been isolated for a long time. They are related to other indigenous groups in the Andaman Islands, but their neighbors cannot understand a word of their language. The continent of Antarctica has no permanent human settlements at all. The only people who periodically live there are international scientists. This vast expanse of ice and snow, roughly the size of the United States and Mexico combined, still has many regions where humans haven't set foot. Satellite imagery and photos that NASA's aircraft made from the air have mapped out the entire continent. So we know where to go, but it's not that easy. The reason for this are all the adjectives that go with Antarctica. It is the coldest, windiest, driest, and brightest of the 7 continents. This makes it virtually unlivable. More than 99% of its surface is covered with a permanent sheet of ice. Its thickness ranges from 1 mile to as many as 3 miles in some places. That's half the height of Mount Everest. Now, the Himalayan range contains the world's tallest unclimbed mountain. It is also the tallest mountain in Bhutan. In the local language, the mountain's name translates as White Peak of the 3 spiritual brothers. Out of respect for the spiritual beliefs of the local population, national authorities restricted and then completely banned mountaineering at the beginning of the 21st century. To this day, there is no evidence that any climber has ever managed to successfully reach the summit of this mysterious mountain.
The concrete of gigantic construction is cracking, barely keeping thousands of tons of water under control. That's when a tiny quake shakes the ground. It becomes a game changer. The old dam gives up. An enormous amount of water dashes through the rapidly growing ruptures, pressing on the crumbling wall of stone. Another moment, and the huge dam disappears among powerful waterfalls rushing toward the village down in the valley. When a large dam hits 50 years old, it reaches its alert age. But it's basically a warning that maintaining the dam is going to get much harder, and the risk factor starts going up. A recent study by the UN Institute for Water, Environment and Health discovered that the UK and Japan have the most dams in this alert age category. No wonder. In both countries, the average dam is over 100 years old. If you, like me, are wondering why so many dams are getting old at the same time, the answer is pretty simple. Back in the middle of the 20th century, there was a massive dam building boom. In the late 1950s through the 1970s, countries built over 1,100 dams every year. But after 1990, the construction frenzy slowed down. No more than 500 new dams appeared every year, and since 2000, this number has dropped even more, to below 300. But the huge problem is that many of the dams built during that mid-century boom are all aging at the same time, and a lot of countries are facing infrastructure problems at the moment. Because what happens when these dams get too old? If they're not maintained, they're likely to start to fail, and that's a real disaster, both for water supplies and safety. It's like a ginormous water-based game of Jenga. And like in the real thing, we need to make sure those pieces don't fall. A disaster like the one we're talking about happened to the Bancha'a Dam built in 1952. This structure collapsed in 1975 after catastrophic rains from Typhoon Nina, leading to the loss of up to 240,000 lives. One of the reasons was the dam's poor design. It wasn't built to withstand extreme conditions. So, when the region faced unprecedented downpours, the dam overflowed and collapsed. I bet you're now super eager to know whether that dam near your home is going to fail. Well, if you find it on our list of the world's most dangerous dams, maybe it's time to relocate. The Hoover Dam is one of the highest dams in the USA, standing on the Colorado River at the border between Nevada and Arizona. Towering at over 726 feet, it's a stunning sight, as well as a powerhouse of energy. Its base is as thick as 2 soccer fields are long, and each spillway can handle the volume of water that flows over Niagara Falls. But experts warn that if the gigantic Hoover Dam breaks down, it'll most likely lead to catastrophic consequences, putting millions of lives at risk. The problem is, the dam is getting old. Plus, it's located in a seismically active area. The Almendra Dam is the highest dam in Spain. It was constructed between 1963 and 1970, and its main purpose is to control the flow of the river Tormes. This dam is no joke. Just a small manipulation could unleash a wave of destruction. So it's actually a serious concern for those living downstream. The Jinping Dam, often referred to as the Jinping First Cascade, is the tallest dam in the world. Its height is 1,001 feet. You'll find it in China. It was constructed to regulate the flow of the Yelong River. This structure carries immense responsibility, producing between 16 and 18 billion kilowatt hours annually. The average U.S. household consumes about 11,000 kilowatt hours per year. It means that the energy produced by the Jinping hydropower station is enough to supply around 1.6 million households. The Kariba Dam is a colossal structure built on the Zambezi River between Zambia and Zimbabwe. Multiple authorities carry out its maintenance, but according to reports, if repairs are not conducted as soon as possible, the dam could lead to terrible destruction in the surrounding regions. It's crucial to keep an eye on this giant. The Mosul Dam is one of the most dangerous dams in the world. It's constructed of loose mud instead of concrete. This design mishap has led to ongoing erosion. The mud gets washed away by the river slowly and steadily. People work around the clock to repair and maintain the dam, but it's still a crucial site of concern. The Idukki Dam, located in Kerala, India, is a magnificent double curvature arch dam standing on the Periyar River. It's one of the highest arch dams in Asia, and it holds a huge volume of water. If a problem occurs at this dam, the consequences will be tragic for large areas. Such a disaster is likely to wipe out countless lives. So, the upkeep of the dam is crucial for everyone's safety. The Three Gorges Dam in China is one of the largest dams in the world and the world's biggest hydroelectric power station, completed in 2012. The dam is nearly 600 feet tall and stretches for 7,660 feet. That's more than half the width of Manhattan. The construction is so huge and powerful that experts say it's even had serious impacts on Earth itself. For example, affecting the rotation of our planet. However great it is, this dam poses a serious risk to the environment and safety. For one thing, it was built in an earthquake-prone area. Yikes. Plus, sediment buildup in the reservoir might make the construction less stable. Also, when they were building this dam, they had to relocate over 1 million people and significantly change the ecosystem. Famous for its beauty, the Monticello Dam in the USA attracts thousands of visitors each year. One of the reasons people are so eager to come there is its captivating glory hole. Indeed, at first sight, it may look like a picturesque feature. But in reality, this glory hole is actually a doorway to danger. It's basically a giant concrete funnel sticking up out of the dam. When the lake's surface level rises over 440 feet above sea level, which is close to overflowing the dam, the water starts draining out through the funnel as if from a bathtub. It creates a hypnotizing swirl, but you wouldn't want to get too close and get lost in the process. Nestled on the Columbia River in Washington, the Grand Coulee Dam has been powering the Pacific Northwest since 1942. It contains nearly 12 million cubic yards of concrete, which is enough to build a sidewalk 4 feet wide and 4 inches thick and wrap it twice around the equator. But this magnificent structure has some worries too. It's an aging structure, and at over 80 years old, it needs lots of TLC. It's located in a seismically active zone, which brings its stability into question. The Kurobe Dam in Japan is a stunning 610 feet tall. It was finished in 1963, so the structure is already pretty old. Japan's earthquakes makes this dam a bit nervous too. And last but not least, the area is prone to heavy rainfall. Intense rain might put extra pressure on the structure. On the Indus River, the Tarbela Dam is the largest earth-filled dam in the world. It was completed in 1976. Its issues include sediment buildup, which reduces its storage capacity. Plus, climate change has altered water flow, threatening the stability of the dam. The main reason we build dams is for irrigation. They help get water to our crops, and a whopping 40% of the food we eat around the globe depends on these big water-holding structures. Next on the list is hydropower. Dams are like giant batteries, turning flowing water into electricity. Then we have water supply, flood control, and even such fun activities as boating and fishing. But since dams are getting older, something needs to be done to protect people living close to them. The US is leading the way in something called dam removal, having taken down more than 1,200 dams in the last 30 years. Old dams are not only risky, but also expensive to maintain, so taking them down is often the smartest and cheapest move. The snowpack over your head splits in two right in front of your eyes and starts tumbling down in the frozen slope to its resting place far, far below. Anything in its way is crushed under the immense mass of snow and debris. You're witnessing an avalanche, one of the most dangerous natural disasters. But what if I tell you about another kind of avalanche, no less blood-chilling than the mountain one? And the most bizarre thing about it is that it occurs underwater. Underwater avalanches are powerful and disastrous natural phenomena, often much more dangerous than land ones. They have the potential to wreak havoc on the entire planet, leading to catastrophic consequences. The most alarming thing? They occur all the time under the surface of the ocean, impossible to see, predict, and extremely difficult to measure. Such avalanches can get 100 times larger than land ones, and they pose a great risk to the world's communications, capable of leaving the entire planet without the internet. But we'll talk about it a bit later. First, let's go 60,000 years back into the past. We're near the northwest coast of Africa, ready to witness the colossal scale and devastating impact of a ginormous underwater avalanche. It started as a quite small underwater landslide in the Agadir Canyon. At first, it was just 0.35 cubic miles of material. But in no time, this mass increased more than 100 times in size while traveling across the Atlantic Ocean floor. As the avalanche sped up and grew, it picked up gravel, sand, rocks, and mud. It carved a devastating path through one of the world's largest submarine canyons, wiping out all forms of animal and plant life on its way. The disastrous flow was so powerful that it literally eroded a 250-mile stretch of the canyon, cutting hundreds of feet into its sides and damaging a total area of 1,740 square miles. That's the area of more than 3.5 New York cities. As for the force of the flow, it was so immense that it propelled massive boulders up the canyon walls to heights of up to 430 feet. Before scientists discovered the evidence of this catastrophic event, they had seriously underestimated the scale of destruction caused by submarine avalanches. By the way, these devastating catastrophes can start not only far away in the ocean, but also at estuaries. Let's go back to 14 January 2020 and see for ourselves. A turbidity current, a rapid, downhill flow of water containing a lot of sediment, rushed more than 680 miles from the Congo River estuary in the deep sea. This current appeared due to two factors: terrible flooding along the Congo River in late December 2019 and unusually large spring tides. This resulted in an avalanche of sand and mud. Its volume was equivalent to 1/3 of all the sediment produced annually by all the rivers in the world. This sediment avalanche accelerated, increasing in speed from 17 feet per second in the upper part of the Congo Canyon to 26 feet per second when it reached the end of the channel, almost 700 miles away from the coastline. This route made it the longest avalanche of sediment ever measured on our planet. 2 days later, the flow reached the deep ocean. The avalanche broke 2 seabed telecommunication cables, cutting internet data speeds all the way across West, Central, and South Africa. Now, before this disaster, scientists considered that measuring powerful deep-sea avalanches was impractical. But the sediment flow in the Congo Canyon could be monitored directly, finally allowing researchers to assess how major river floods connected to the deep sea. They also concluded that how often underwater avalanches occurred depended on where the observer was. Seafloor canyons that are close to river mouths can experience several tiny avalanches per year. Other systems, far from river discharges like the Agadir Canyon, can only have one monster of an avalanche every 10,000 years or so. You're likely wondering, what can trigger an avalanche under the surface of the ocean? Well, earthquakes, typhoons, high tides, river floods, and even volcanic eruptions. And due to our changing climate, such events become more and more frequent and intense. At the same time, these triggers don't mean that an avalanche is bound to happen, nor do they relate to the scale of the event. See for yourself. In 1755, a powerful earthquake hit the coast of Portugal, wiping out large parts of Lisbon. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives during that disaster, but it only triggered a tiny underwater avalanche. And in 1929, a large earthquake off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, triggered the largest underwater avalanche ever recorded. The flow traveled at a speed of 42 miles per hour, carrying boulders, sand, and mud. It snapped 11 seabed cables on its journey downhill. The avalanche was so powerful, it produced a tsunami that claimed the lives of 28 people along the coastline. Now, submarine avalanches are totally invisible because they happen deep under the ocean surface, which makes them extremely hard to study. But we must find a way because these flows are super important. They transport sediments, nutrients, and even pollutants across the ocean floor. So, a research team from Liverpool decided to unravel this mystery. Over the last 40 years, they've collected more than 300 samples from the ocean floor. Combined with seismic and bathymetric data, which is a fancy word for ocean mapping, they managed to reconstruct a massive submarine avalanche. It was the first time an underwater avalanche of this size was mapped out. An even cooler thing, The event itself started off pretty modestly, but it quickly evolved into a colossal avalanche that grew to more than 650 feet tall. To put that into perspective, imagine a skyscraper-sized avalanche zooming from Liverpool to London, cutting a trench 100 feet deep and 9 miles wide. Then it spread out over an area bigger than the UK, covering it with several feet of sand and mud. That's like burying a whole country. These findings are actually a big deal because they show that even a small underwater landslide can turn into something massive and super destructive. But that's not the worst. Think about undersea internet cables, which are essential for global communication. There are more than 550 active seafloor cables around the world. Their combined length is a whopping 870,000 miles. That's enough to wrap around our planet 35 times. When a submarine avalanche breaks seafloor cables, the effects are usually super expensive and devastating. For example, in 2006, an earthquake in Taiwan triggered underwater avalanches that cut loads of seafloor cables connecting Southeast Asia with the rest of the world. The largest internet operator in China had a 90% loss of traffic to the USA at the peak of the event. As for Taiwan itself, it experienced between 74 to 100% loss in traffic to neighboring islands. So now you probably get why we need to learn more about this natural phenomenon. Luckily, researchers at Tulane University have found a way to study it in 3D. Previous studies only looked at submarine avalanches in 2D, which didn't give the full picture of how they actually behaved. The new research focused on how underwater flows interacted with mini basins, natural features on the ocean floor that look like shallow bowls. Despite being called mini, these bowls can be huge, up to 4 square miles. When turbidity currents flow into these mini basins, they don't just stop. No, they hit the far side and curl back around like water eddies in a stream. These swirling flows move the sediment around before it settles on the ocean floor. The size of the mini basin and the speed of the flow can change how the current behaves. If the basin is big and the current is slow, it starts to fill up with sediment. But if you crank up the flow speed or shrink the basin, the current starts to overflow, spilling over the basin. To study all this, the researchers created a mini version of a mini basin in a pool and used different speeds of flow to simulate turbidity currents. They even made their own sediment mixtures to see how different sizes of particles would behave. In the end, they managed to mimic real-life ocean conditions, but on a smaller, manageable scale. Pretty cool, huh? It was June 1928 when Mr. Keller almost lost his life in a terrifying natural disaster. He was outside with his family when he noticed an umbrella-shaped cloud that seemed to be approaching them. It gave him a sense of foreboding. A tornado was probably forming there. Indeed, in no time, 3 huge funnel clouds were dashing their way. After rushing his family into the storm cellar, Keller decided to have another look, and what he saw both terrified and mesmerized him. The twister was directly overhead, but inside the swirling cloud, everything was eerily still. The man could feel a strong, grassy smell. He had trouble breathing. He looked up and saw a circular opening right overhead. It was around 50 to 100 feet across and around half a mile high. Keller could clearly see the walls of the rotating cloud. Constant bursts of lightning zigzagged from side to side non-stop, illuminating this horror movie scene. The man could also see many smaller tornadoes forming and breaking free. A deafening, hissing noise was overwhelming. And the next moment, the tornado skipped over Keller's house and smashed the home of his neighbors. Mr. Keller wasn't the only person to see the tornado from the inside and live to tell the tale. But other survivors didn't end up as unscathed. It seemed to be a regular day when Chris Tubing from Dallas, Texas got to the Little Caesars in 2019. They had run out of pizzas, so he decided to wait. Well, it was a grave mistake. A powerful tornado hit the shopping mall where he was staying and pulled him out of the building. Chris managed to find a support column and held on for dear life. but no muscle strength could compare to the terrifying power of the tornado. Tavang was lifted into the air and thrown into a truck parked in front of the restaurant. He tried to hold on to the hood, but there was nothing to grab. In the end, he managed to hold on to the rim of the left front tire and stayed there until the whole nightmare stopped. The tornado Chris survived had sustained winds of 140 miles per hour and was 13 football fields wide at the base. Eric Simmons recalled taking cover from a tornado in May 2019 by climbing into his truck. Once inside, he looked out of his right windshield and saw vines growing along the fence. They were moving around in a bizarre way that confused the man. And then it all started. Suddenly, everything Eric could see was wind and pitch-black darkness. Then, a section of a roof flew over him and shredded apart mid-air. The truck's back windshield shattered, showering the man with shards of glass. A tree in front of him was lifted into the air like a twig, and the fence blew over the top of the truck. Simmons could feel the back of the vehicle lifting. He could see the power lines exploding right in front of his eyes. Even though the visibility was terrible, he could still see the flashes. It all lasted around 45 seconds, but to him, an eternity seemed to have passed. When the coast grew clear, Eric got out of the car, but he could barely walk after the shock he had lived through. He couldn't speak. It was one of the most horrifying and traumatic experiences of his life. According to the man, the real reason why he was so terrified was because he had no training, no warning, and no defense against whatever was coming. Later, he found out that the tornado had almost taken his life at a speed of 86 to 110 miles per hour and was around 75 to 100 yards across. A tornado is a rotating column of air that touches the ground. Sometimes it's connected to the base of a thunderstorm. The wind speeds inside tornadoes can top hundreds of miles an hour. No wonder they have enormously devastating potential, picking up objects, unrooting trees, destroying buildings, you name it. The problem with escaping a tornado is that it's not always easy to see. The wind, however severe it is invisible. The first sign of an approaching tornado might be the infamous rumble resembling the noise a moving freight train produces. There are also some other sounds indicating that a tornado is coming, but the human ear can't perceive those. When you spot that classic tornado cone, it means it has already developed a condensation funnel made of water, dust, and debris. The most destructive tornadoes are born from rotating thunderstorms, called supercells. Luckily, those are something meteorologists can actually notice because such storms have a well-defined appearance on radars. Experts believe that the difference in the temperature of such a storm can determine how likely a tornado is to form. And still, there's a lot we don't know about this process. For example, the question about why and where tornadoes are most likely to appear remains unanswered. The strength of tornadoes is measured with the enhanced Fujita scale. The rating goes from 0 to 5, considering the damage caused by a tornado and its wind speeds, where EF0 is the weakest tornado and EF5 is a tornado I hope you will never ever come across. The EF scale rounds off at wind speeds of 318 miles per hour, with strong frame houses being lifted off foundations and carried long distances to be eventually broken into pieces. Cars fly through the air for more than 328 feet away, and steel-reinforced structures are left badly damaged. Despite this terrifying power and ferocity of tornadoes, authorities report that even the worst of them have a 99% survival rate. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't take all possible precautions to avoid ending up inside one. Stay away from doors and windows. Move to an interior room if possible, and use pillows, blankets, and mattresses to protect yourself from flying debris. If stranded outside during a tornado, crawl into a ditch and cover yourself, protecting the head. Now, there's another twister that is as scary as a tornado, but this one forms in the water. Whirlpools appear when fast-flowing water crashes into an obstacle or another current. The water starts swirling in a downward spiral, creating a vortex that can pull objects, animals, and even small boats that happen to be nearby to the bottom. One more way for a whirlpool to form is the sudden appearance of a sinkhole created by a collapsed cave, for example. This makes water flood the hollow structure and creates a whirlpool similar to the one you see when you pull the plug out of a bath filled with water. While some whirlpools are small and brief, others can reach enormous sizes and be driven by constant currents. The most dangerous of them are maelstroms. If you get into a whirlpool like that, your chances to get back to the surface are slim. The incessant movement of the water and its pulling power can leave you disoriented and stuck without air. That's what happened to Stuart Falstone when he got trapped in a whirlpool. His first instinct was to swim out of it, but this idea proved to be hopeless. The footage filmed by the cameraman attached to his helmet later showed that the man had been underwater for almost 3.5 minutes. He had probably been dragged all the way down to the riverbed. There, the pull of the twister lessened a bit and finally released its hold. The guy was lucky to get spotted face down in the water and pulled to the surface by a kayaker. The depth a whirlpool can pull you down to can vary. It depends on its power and size. Sadly, not everyone who got trapped in a whirlpool survived and got out again. In different ways in which whirlpools form means that sometimes they can appear out of the blue. You can't predict this process and get no warning. So the best way to stay safe is to wear your life jacket at all times when in the water. If you get pulled into a whirlpool, try not to move in the same direction as the water flow. Aim for the outer edge rather than the center of the twister. If you're lucky, the whirlpool might throw you back up. There have been precedents. And if you come over a whirlpool in a boat or kayak, do your best to stop the boat from filling with water. The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" The Titanic strikes the ice. Water starts flooding in. Third-class passengers are locked up. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Panic sets in. Violins are playing. The ship sinks. Well, we all know the story of the movie Titanic like the back of our hand by now. But what if I told you that Hollywood lied to us? To tell the real story of what happened that freezing night in 1912, we need to rewind a bit. The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" Yep, that part was true. Just before 11:40 at night, Frederick Fleet noticed something darker than the sea directly ahead. As the ship got closer, he realized it was an iceberg. The engines were quickly reversed and the ship turned sharply. Instead of hitting it head-on, Titanic scraped along the side of the berg, sprinkling ice on the forward deck. If you remember, in the movie, Jack and Rose are having a romantic moment when they feel the ship shudder after hitting the iceberg. Everything shakes as if they were in the middle of a light earthquake. Some real-life passengers reported feeling something similar after the impact. But according to Titanic survivor Frank Prentice, it wasn't exactly like that. He said there was no impact as such, and it all felt more like slamming on your car brakes. The ship stopped, and that was that. Some people even slept right through the collision, confirming that there wasn't such an abrupt impact. Mr. Prentice, curious about what had happened, left his cabin and went out to the deck. When he got there, all he could see was a little ice on the surface, not the towering iceberg that Jack and Rose saw. But as we all know by now, the real damage happened below the waterline, where the iceberg had a jagged spur that slashed a 300-foot gash in Titanic's hull. Once the crew realized how severe the damage was, they immediately began sending distress calls to nearby ships, asking for help. At some point in the movie, the radio operator goes to the captain and says there is only one ship nearby, the RMS Carpathia, which later ends up rescuing many passengers. But in real life, there were more ships around. It's believed that the SS Californian was only about 23 miles away. This ship might have actually seen the Titanic sinking, or at the very least, seen its rockets exploding high in the sky. Yet, for reasons we will never fully understand, they didn't try to help. Let's get back to the story. Now, people need to get off the ship. At 12:45, lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered. Just like in the movie, women and children were told to go first. But in reality, some women were hesitant and even refused to get into the lifeboats. Mr. Prentice said this happened mainly for 2 reasons. First, these lifeboats were high and passengers were terrified of the 70-foot drop from the deck to the ocean below. And second, most women didn't believe the Titanic would actually sink. It was called unsinkable after all. So the idea of getting into a lifeboat seemed pointless at the time. This mindset probably explains why Eloise Smith, a first-class passenger, recalled that there was no panic or chaos at first. Other survivors backed this up, saying that no women or kids were crying. But one thing that was indeed concerning, at least for the crew, was the possibility that the lifeboats might buckle under too much weight. This is one of the theories why the first few lifeboats left carrying only a fraction of their full capacity. Like lifeboat number 7, which only carried 27 people in it, even though it could hold up to 65. In total, Titanic had 20 lifeboats, which could carry about half of the 2,200 people on board that night. But that didn't happen. And now we know the passengers had no idea there weren't enough for everyone. As women were calmly getting into the first lifeboats, musicians headed up to the deck. Their only goal was to play and keep the passengers calm. That's a pretty well-known fact. But the real story is that some survivors said they never saw or heard the band. No violinists whatsoever. It's not like Hollywood misled you though. The musicians did play for over 2 hours after the ship had hit the iceberg. So maybe these passengers were just too panicked to notice the songs, or the musicians started playing later than we think. Now it's time to talk about the terrible treatment that third-class passengers received. The movie portrayed the crew as cruel, locking the less fortunate below deck like animals, giving them no chance to reach the lifeboats and save their lives. But the official inquiry into the disaster suggested that wasn't true. I mean, yes, fewer third-class passengers survived compared to those in first and second class, but there were other factors at play. Many third-class passengers were reluctant to leave the ship, clinging to their belongings, and had a harder time making their way up from the cabins, which were at extreme ends of the ship. Some survivors confirmed that they were not locked up. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Mrs. George Wabi, a Lebanese woman traveling in third class, said that when chaos had erupted, some brave crew members and well-dressed first-class passengers had actually helped her get up to the first-class deck and eventually onto a lifeboat. At first, the Titanic was sinking slowly, bit by bit. Passengers reported seeing the water rising and hearing pops and cracks. Then, there was a loud boom. Some said there had been just one explosion, while others described it as a series of smaller explosions, which they'd thought had been the bulkheads giving way. And there's also a group of people who said they had only heard a rumbling sound. So not everyone agreed on the sound they had heard, but one thing is a fact. By 2:18 in the morning, the lights on Titanic went out, and the ship plunged into complete darkness. As the bow continued sinking, the stern rose out of the water, putting immense pressure on the middle of the ship. This caused the Titanic to break in two. In James Cameron's movie, this moment is pretty dramatic, with the ship sinking almost straight down into the water. But in reality, the break probably happened at a much lower angle, likely just below the waterline. Even so, it tilted enough that people couldn't stay on their feet and started sliding into the water. One interesting thing is that it wasn't until the wreckage was found in 1985 that it was finally confirmed the Titanic had broken apart. Up until then, survivors had given conflicting stories. At least 8 survivors claimed they had seen the ship split. Emily Ryerson, a first-class passenger, described it as if the Titanic had been sliced in half with a knife. But there was also a small number of witnesses that insisted Titanic had gone down intact. At the time, this theory was more accepted because most people still didn't believe that the supposedly indestructible ship could break in half. So why the conflicting reports? Okay, so what you don't see in the movies, for obvious reasons, is how incredibly dark it was when the tragedy happened. It was like being in a room with no light, where you can only make out shapes and shadows. That's what it was like on the lifeboats. This means passengers couldn't really see what was happening, and most of those who were close to the ship either lost their lives or were too focused on trying to survive to pay attention to the details of the wreck. Although James Cameron's film didn't fully capture how terrifyingly dark the disaster truly was, the 2012 TV series Titanic did a better job of showing the pitch-black horror of that night. Even then, the reality was much darker and more terrifying than either of these two productions could portray.
Most people know that pyramids were built as grand tombs for the pharaohs, designed to ensure they had a smooth journey to the afterlife. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, was constructed for the pharaoh Khufu. But what most people don't know is that this whole pyramid building trend started right here with the step pyramid of Djoser about 4,700 years ago. This massive structure was built for Pharaoh Djoser, a ruler from Egypt's 3rd dynasty. It rises 7 layers high above the ground and stands about 200 feet tall. We think of it today as a phenomenal architectural project, but for ancient Egyptians, the step pyramid of Djoser turned out to be more like a massive experiment, a trial run, if you will, to perfect their building skills before they moved on to even more ambitious pyramids. Reaching new heights is super exciting, but the real mystery is what is going on below the ground. In this pyramid's underground labyrinth, there is a network of tunnels stretching about 3.5 miles long, and some researchers believe these tunnels might have been part of a sophisticated water system that could completely change what we think about pyramid construction. Let's talk about this massive complex located in Saqqara. Surrounding the pyramid, there's what's known as a dry moat, a continuous trench that is up to 164 feet wide and almost 2 miles long. It forms a sort of rectangular shape around the pyramid. This trench has an average depth of about 65 feet. Now, if you were to add up all the earth and rock they dug out to create this moat, it would be about 10 times the volume of the step pyramid itself. For the longest time, people just assumed this trench was nothing more than a huge quarry, a place where they dug up stone and clay to build the step pyramid. Makes sense, right? But when you take a closer look, it doesn't add up. The trench is too narrow and deep to be practical for mining, and its layout doesn't match anything we know about ancient Egyptian quarrying methods. Plus, some sections of the trench are actually covered with a rocky ceiling, which would have made it nearly impossible to use as a quarry. Another theory suggests that the dry moat had some kind of spiritual significance. Maybe it was a sacred place, where souls of nobles gathered to serve the late king in the afterlife. There are even niches in the walls that work as a hint at this spiritual function. But most researchers believe that this purpose likely developed much later, long after the complex was built for Djoser. So what was the moat really designed for? In 2020, a researcher came up with a pretty intriguing idea. It is possible that this trench was actually designed to collect and manage water, especially after heavy rainfalls. Now, that makes sense when you consider the location. The moat sits in an area that could easily have been flooded by runoff water from nearby plains. This could also explain why the trench wasn't used for new graves until much later when the climate became drier and less prone to flooding. The story becomes even more intriguing as this trench appears to be part of a larger, more complex hydraulic system within the Djoser complex. It is like the trench has several compartments, carefully carved out of the rock and connected by tunnels. These compartments likely served as a part of a water treatment system, where water would flow from one compartment to the next, getting cleaner as it moved along. Now, here is where things start to tie into the pyramid itself. The Djoser complex has a series of underground shafts, and some researchers think that water from the moat's deep trench might have been used to power a hydraulic lift system. And this giant water-powered elevator could have been used to raise the heavy stones needed to build the pyramid. It worked like a volcano, but instead of lava, water did the heavy lifting. Imagine a big deep hole in the ground at the center of the pyramid site. Inside this hole, there was a huge wooden platform, kind of like a giant raft that could move up and down. When the workers wanted to lift a heavy stone, they would fill the hole with water. As the water rose, the wooden platform started to float up, carrying the stone with it, almost like a giant water-powered elevator. When the stone reached the right height, the workers slid it off the platform and onto the pyramid. The idea is that water from the deep trench, after being cleaned and filtered, would flow into these shafts. A massive float, possibly made of wood, would then rise as the water filled the shaft, lifting the stones up to where they were needed for construction. Once the stone was in place, they'd let the water out, lowering the platform back down to the bottom, ready to lift the next stone. This fancy hydraulic lift system could have been a game changer, making the whole building process a lot faster and more efficient without using a lot of workforce. It is like the ancient Egyptians were already embracing the whole idea of work smarter, not harder. But of course, not everyone is on board with this theory. Some experts argue that the area where the step pyramid of Djoser was built couldn't have held enough water from occasional rains to maintain such a fancy hydraulic system. The main theory suggests that, in the past, there might have been some kind of lake nearby that would have filled up after a period of rain, and this lake could have supplied water to the complex's hydraulic system. But there is no mention of such a lake in any ancient Egyptian writings, so it might be more of a what-if situation than a reality. And then there's the issue of the hard work itself. Remember when I said this method could have allowed the ancient builders to raise stones with far less effort? Well, that might not be entirely true. According to some experts, just building this hydraulic device would have required a lot more heavy work than simply moving the stone blocks using good old-fashioned manpower. And let's not forget, the step pyramid of Djoser is like a baby pyramid compared to those that came later. The stones used for Djoser's pyramid weighed, on average, about 660 pounds each, which is nothing compared to the more than 2.5-ton blocks used later for the pyramid of Chephren. If this cool water lift theory gets completely ruled out, we still need to explain how this pyramid was built in the first place. To answer that, we need to rewind a bit and talk about the original plans. See, before Djoser's tomb became a pyramid, the idea was to construct a simple mastaba. This type of tomb was pretty common in earlier periods, a flat-roofed, rectangular structure with sloping sides. But after the original mastaba was finished, they decided to expand it a bit by adding more layers on top. And then they added even more layers, until the construction reached 6 distinctive steps, each one smaller than the previous. And they probably did all this by raising those heavy stones using ramps, not a water-powered elevator. There is still so much we don't know about the step pyramid of Djoser. More research is definitely needed to fully understand how this system worked, or if it even existed at all. But the idea of using water to help build the pyramid adds a whole new layer to our understanding of ancient Egyptian engineering. It's a powerful reminder of just how clever and resourceful those builders were, using the natural landscape and the power of water to create one of the most iconic monuments in history. In 2011, scientists from Chile found a weird-looking fossil in Antarctica that looked like a squashed football. Almost 10 years later, the rock just sat on a shelf in Chile's National Museum of Natural History with no specific label. It went by The Thing in the museum because it looked like something from a science fiction movie. When the scientists finally got their hands on the strange fossil, it turned out it was actually a giant soft-shell egg from around 66 million years ago. This one is more than 11 inches long and 7 inches wide. A regular chicken egg is just 2.5 inches long, and an ostrich egg is almost 6 inches long for comparison. So, The Thing won the title of the biggest soft-shell egg ever found and the second largest egg of any animal we know of. The only bigger egg that was ever found was that of the extinct Madagascan elephant bird, which is also 1.5 times as tall as Michael Jordan. The bird, not the egg. The Antarctic egg is also special because it's the first fossil ever found in this part of the world. So, whoever left it there must have been one big creature, probably a giant sea turtle that lived long ago, like a mosasaur. This is surprising because most scientists thought these creatures didn't even lay eggs, so this discovery could change what we know about them. The egg is also unique because it has a thin eggshell and no pores, which is totally different from most dinosaur eggs. It actually looks more like the eggs of lizards and snakes, but it came from a giant creature related to these animals. No known dinosaurs or flying reptiles from that time and place were big enough to lay such a huge egg, so it must have been a mosasaur after all. But we can't be 100% sure. Scientists did a lot of work and studied 259 types of living reptiles, like lizards and snakes, and their eggs. From this, they figured out that the mommy who laid the egg was probably at least 23 feet long, not counting her tail. During the late Cretaceous period, this part of Antarctica might have been like a nursery. Paleontologists have found bones of tiny mosasaurs and plesiosaurs in the same area, along with bones from the grown-up ones. Archaeologists in Norway made another cool but literally discovery and found dozens of arrows that had been hidden in ice for 6,000 years. They were melting out of a large ice patch in the high mountains, covering an area of about 45 football fields. In 2014 and 2016, when the summers were extra warm, scientists went to an ice patch called Langfoni to look around. They also found lots of reindeer bones and antlers there. Some of the arrows were whole and some in pieces, along with 5 arrowheads around the melting ice patch. This is more arrows than have been found at any other frozen site in the world. Some of the 68 found arrows date back to the Neolithic period, and the newest ones are from the 14th century of the Common Era. Ice is like the perfect time machine that can preserve whatever ends up there in an almost perfect condition. Langfoni became famous as one of the first ice patch sites after a local hiker found a 3,300-year-old leather shoe right next to its edge. Scientists are studying places like this to understand how people use these sites and how the ice patches from Norway to North America changed over time. Now, once upon a time, around 32,000 years ago, to be exact, a squirrel buried some seeds near a river in Siberia. Am I the only one getting the Ice Age vibes? Anyway, these seeds belong to a plant with cute white flowers. Thousands of years later, a group of scientists found these seeds buried deep in the frozen ground, about as far down as a 12-story building is tall. The seeds were surrounded by ice and bones of animals, like mammoths, bison, and woolly rhinoceroses. The mature seeds had been damaged, maybe by some squirrel, but some of the younger seeds still had good plant parts inside them. The scientists carefully took those out and put them in small containers to help them grow. And here comes the coolest part. They were able to grow the plants. Their flowers were shaped a little differently from the flowers of the same plant that grows today. After a year, the Ice Age plant even made new seeds. Based on this, the scientists suggested that permafrost could be a depository for an ancient gene pool, and we could find extinct species there and bring them back to life. Scientists on an icebreaker in Antarctica were looking for whales, but found something way more unusual. The camera behind the ship, which is as heavy as a car, detected 16 million ice fish nests on the floor of the Weddell Sea. The nests were located about every 10 inches in all directions and covered an area of 93 square miles, which is slightly bigger than the whole of Washington, D.C. The colony even had a distinct border, which was a line in the sand. The scientists were in the area because they were studying a special spot in the ocean where the water was a little warmer than the water around it. In this warmer water, they found tiny animals called zooplankton near the top. When the young ice fish hatch, they swim up to this area to eat the zooplankton before going back down to the seafloor to grow up and have their own offspring. Since there was so much food, it made sense to see ice fish in this warm water. But they didn't expect to find such a huge number of ice fish nests, much more than anyone had ever seen before. New Zealand's Antarctic Heritage Fund found some old photo negatives in a hut in Antarctica. They turned out to be unique images from the Ross Sea Party. It was a famous failed expedition led by Ernest Shackleton. He wanted to become the first person to cross Antarctica by land, from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, passing through the South Pole. But things went wrong when their ship, the Aurora, was blown out to sea. They had to use the hut from another explorer, Captain Robert Falcon Scott. His goal was to be the first person to reach the North Pole, but sadly, he didn't succeed either. The negatives were made of cellulose nitrate and were found stuck together in the small box. The Trust took the negatives back to New Zealand, where they carefully separated them and discovered 22 hidden images. Many of the photos were damaged, but the Trust could still recognize some familiar places around McMurdo Sound, a well-known area in Antarctica. No one knows for sure who took the pictures. In December 2021, some scientists noticed a strange mark on the Larsen Ice Shelf, a giant sheet of ice off the eastern coast of Antarctica. They thought it might be a river flowing under the ice, so they drilled down over 1,600 feet to check it out. They expected to find water, but they didn't expect to see that the water was full of fast-moving creatures called amphipods. The scientists also found that the water in the underground river had unusual layers of currents moving in different directions, which they still don't fully understand. Another surprising thing happened during their research. On December 20th of the same year, a volcano erupted far away in Tonga, and the pressure waves from the eruption were detected all the way down in the ice river in Antarctica. It shows how everything on our planet is connected, even in the most distant places. This place has no time zone, no landmass, and the sun rises and sets here just once a year. For over 400 years, since the era of King Henry VIII, thousands of explorers from all over the world were trying to reach this elusive spot, the North Pole. Some were hoping to find a northwest or northeast passage to China and the Indies, and others just wanted to see what it was like. In 1773, the British Royal Navy organized the first scientific expedition to the North Pole. Constantine Phipps volunteered to lead the mission. It was difficult for the two ships to move through thick ice, and they had to be towed using smaller boats. At some point, Phipps was ready to leave the ships as they saw a completely frozen sea. But in the end, they broke free from the ice and escaped into the open sea to return home without reaching the goal. In 1882, American explorer James Booth Lockwood managed to get closer to the goal than anyone else. By that time, at least 750 people in 42 expeditions had lost their lives trying to make it to the pole. On the 7th of September, 1909, the New York Times came out with a sensational front page. Peary discovers the North Pole after 8 trials in 23 years. Robert E. Peary, an American explorer, claimed to have reached the North Pole in April of the same year. But communication back then was slower than now, so the message had only reached New York by September. A week before the famous headline, the New York Herald had published its own front-page sensation. The North Pole is discovered by Dr. Frederick A. Cook. Cook, another American explorer, had vanished into the Arctic for over a year and had everyone convinced he reached the pole in April 1908, a whole year before Peary. It was tricky to provide evidence any of them had actually reached the goal back then. Their goal was constantly moving on sea ice, unlike the South Pole on steady land, so they couldn't just leave a flag or some other proof there. A travel diary full of details of the journey, including daily distances, the position of the stars, and the like, would probably do as evidence. But neither Cook nor Peary were able to provide any of this backup information. So each of them started a campaign to prove they were honest and trustworthy. Peary was mentioned as the North Pole discoverer until 1988. That's when the National Geographic Society revisited the evidence and found that his records really didn't prove his claim. Cook's claim was neither proven nor disproven. Australian-born British explorer Sir Hubert Wilkins went on his first expedition to the North Pole in 1913. That's when he got the idea to reach the goal by submarine. In 1931, he borrowed a special submarine named O-12 from the U.S. Navy. The future mission had two goals: to do scientific experiments while floating on ice and moving underwater, and to reach the North Pole by traveling beneath the ice. They planned to study the weather, take temperature measurements, and collect water samples from both the surface and the sea floor. The submarine Sir Hubert used was brought to a shipyard in New Jersey to be modified. They added the latest scientific equipment and changed the outside so the submarine could travel under the ice. On March 16th, the submarine left the shipyard to start its journey to the Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York. But even before leaving the Delaware River, they faced delays. A snowstorm forced them to stop at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and they had to stop again to get more fuel. When the submarine was entering New York Harbor, a crew member who was just 27 years old fell overboard and drowned. The submarine was officially renamed Nautilus, and the grandson of Jules Verne, the author of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which inspired the new name, was there to see it. Before starting their journey, the crew tested the Nautilus in different spots off the New England coast. They faced criticism and were already 2 months behind schedule, so they decided to head straight to England. During their trip across the Atlantic, they sailed into severe storms. On the 13th of June, the starboard engine broke down. Then, the port engine failed because it was overused. While crossing the Atlantic, Sir Hubert Wilkins kept radioing the submarine's position back to the United States. After both engines failed, they sent out an SOS. On June 15th, the USS Wyoming, a huge ship on a training cruise with naval students, reached the Nautilus. The Wyoming towed the broken submarine to Queenstown, Ireland, and then it was taken to Davenport, England for repairs. They had to wait for spare parts from the United States, which caused more delays. Once the Nautilus was fixed, they headed to Bergen, Norway, to meet the submarine science officers and get more equipment. One of the most important additions in Bergen was a diving chamber, which allowed them to lower scientific tools into the water through a special hatch. On August 5th, the Nautilus finally left Bergen and headed north to find ice floes. They had lots of delays because of mechanical problems and storms. One storm even made the submarine tilt at crazy angles. Finally, on August 19th, they saw the first ice floe. For a few days, they followed the ice's edge, looking for a good spot to dive. 3 days later, they tried to dive under the ice, but discovered that the submarine's diving rudders were missing. One diver went overboard to check and saw that someone must have broken off the rudders on purpose. This made Wilkins think that someone on the crew had sabotaged the submarine because they didn't trust the mission. Even without the rudders, Wilkins still wanted to do some of his scientific experiments. On the last day of August, they found a way to force the Nautilus under a 3-foot-thick ice floe. They had to fill the ballast tanks and adjust the trim. They managed to make more dives under this ice this way before the journey ended. After a few more days of trying to do research, Wilkins decided it was too dangerous to stay at sea. The Nautilus arrived at Svalbard, the Norwegian archipelago between mainland Norway and the North Pole, on September 8th, after going through the worst storm of the trip. They planned to go to a port in England, but another storm caused a lot of damage and made the engines fail, so they had to stop in Bergen again. After getting permission from the United States Shipping Board, the Nautilus was towed out of Bergen and sunk in a Norwegian fjord on November 13, 1931. In 1958, a U.S. submarine with the same name, Nautilus, became the first vessel that reached the North Pole by traveling under the ice. This Nautilus was much bigger than the submarines that came before it. It was 319 feet long and weighed 3,590 tons. For comparison, the other Nautilus was 175 feet long. Unlike other submarines, the new Nautilus could stay underwater for a longer time because of its special atomic engine didn't need air and only used a tiny amount of nuclear fuel. On July 23, 1958, it left Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on Operation Sunshine. There were 116 people on board, Commander Anderson, 111 officers and crew, and 4 civilian scientists. The Nautilus traveled north through the Bering Strait and only surfaced once at Point Barrow, Alaska. On August 1st, the submarine left the north coast of Alaska and dove under the Arctic ice cap. The submarine traveled at a depth of 500 feet, with the ice above it between 10 to 50 feet thick. At 11:15 p.m. on August 3rd, Commander Anderson told his crew, "For the world, our country, and the Navy, the North Pole." And the Nautilus went right under the North Pole without stopping. On August 5th, the submarine came up in the Greenland Sea, and then 2 days later, it finished its historic trip in Iceland. So look at this narrow passage between the north of Morocco and the southern part of the Spanish region. It's called the Strait of Gibraltar. There are only 8 miles between the two continents, but for some reason, there's no bridge, despite people having been dreaming for centuries about connecting these two regions. There are places in the world where a bridge over water stretches for a much greater distance. For example, the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway near New Orleans, Louisiana, goes for 24 miles, which is 3 times the length of the hypothetical bridge between Africa and Europe. That's listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the longest continuous bridge passing over water. It consists of 2 parallel bridges and connects the urban area of New Orleans with small settlements in the north of Lake Pontchartrain. 9,000 concrete piles hold more than 1,000 decks above the water. This large-scale structure was built in the middle of the 20th century. It only took 14 months from the start of construction to its completion. American engineers created a unique technology for attaching concrete piles to the base of the bridge, and this bridge is still functioning. So, what's the problem with building a shorter bridge to connect Africa and Europe? Let's first find out the value of the 8-mile bridge that could connect 2 continents and the reason why everyone is talking about it. In fact, the value of such a bridge would be enormous. Diamonds, oil, minerals. Africa is full of valuable materials, and Europe is happy to buy these things. This theoretical bridge could allow people to transport things for trade quickly and comfortably. But now, the exchange of goods between Africa and Europe is only possible thanks to airplanes and cargo ships, and airplanes are extremely expensive because of hefty fuel price tags. In addition, air travel is often delayed because of bad weather. There are long customs procedures and transportation from the airport to the destination. Ships can also be a problem. The narrow area of the Mediterranean Sea, where the 2 continents are closest to each other, is a dangerous place because of storms and strong currents. The transportation of your diamonds is highly dependent on weather conditions. The second advantage of such a bridge would be the creation of tens of thousands of jobs. People from Europe and Africa would build hotels, ports, parks, and even small towns for each other. The coastal parts of both continents would become a new economic center. And just imagine how much investment those places would attract. Europe and Africa would be much closer than ever before. You could drive from a small Spanish town to a safari park in northern Morocco, buy Moroccan tea, get some argan oil, and go home for the evening. Or you could take a high-speed train across the beautiful Mediterranean Sea. People would open hundreds of restaurants, amusement parks, shopping malls, and a museum next to this bridge. But, unfortunately, it's impossible to build such a bridge, at least at the moment. And here's why. The main problem is the Strait of Gibraltar itself, because of its strong currents and seismic activity. How can you start large-scale construction if, in a couple of days, an underwater earthquake can trigger giant waves and take all the ships underwater? Even if you build a bridge, rapid streams of water that constantly change direction can shake the entire structure and tear the connecting parts of the construction. The bridge over the Strait of Gibraltar must have a strong, sturdy system that will withstand seismic activity. Huge resources are required to create such a complex structure. Despite the dangerous passage between the 2 continents, it remains one of the busiest points in the world. It's the only place on the planet connecting the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. About 300 ships pass through this area every day. Not only merchant ships, but also fishing vessels and tourist boats. There are not so many places in the world where you can watch whales coming out of the water. Not only people, but also marine creatures often visit this passage because of the peculiarities of the sea currents. But we'll talk about that later. Another problem is the depth of the strait. In simple words, any bridge over the water is built on long metal piles. Builders and engineers stick piles into the seabed and use them as a holding base for the whole construction. But installing such piles firmly enough is a difficult task because of the uneven seabed. The seabed has a unique geological landscape, irregularities, and different densities of the Earth's rock. There are also reefs, rocks, and pits. Any seabed requires extensive geological studies before piles are installed. However, the bottom of the Strait of Gibraltar is especially difficult because of its depth, almost 3,000 feet. It's one of the deepest straits in the whole world. Just imagine, you'll need the height of 10 Statues of Liberty to reach the surface of the water from the bottom of the strait. What kind of pile should be used there to hold the entire bridge? Most likely, one pile will have to consist of several parts connected into one large metal rod. And don't forget about seismic activity. Let's say you've installed perfectly strong piles, but the next day an earthquake occurs and destroys the entire structure. And a strong current is carrying fortifications all over the Mediterranean Sea. The next problem is probably the most important one, because it concerns marine life. The Strait of Gibraltar has a high salt content. This natural element makes water heavier and makes it descend to the bottom of the deep Mediterranean basin. Then, this salt water pushes up cold water from the seabed into the Atlantic Ocean. These changes in water density, as well as fast currents, create sea vortices and turbulence. It's like a raging cauldron of cold water that raises a lot of nutrients to the surface. The hollows and hills of the Strait of Gibraltar are filled with different substances and sunlight, and this creates ideal conditions for the formation of phytoplankton. Whales, dolphins, and other marine creatures adore this delicacy. That's why you can see about 7 species of whales and dolphins in this place. What might happen to phytoplankton after the start of global construction? Carbon dioxide, crushed rock, tons of dust and ashes, falling building materials, all of this could significantly pollute the environment. Without phytoplankton, many fish would go extinct. Without fish, thousands of fishers wouldn't be able to get food and earn money. But even if the bridge was built, cars and trains would continue to pollute the air and water. This disruption of the delicate balance in this narrow strait can lead to larger-scale environmental disasters. Dolphins and whales may leave to look for food elsewhere, and thus take resources from other marine inhabitants. Like falling dominoes, one problem can follow another. And all this because of one bridge. In 2007, the Spanish Ministry of Environmental Protection introduced speed limits for all ships sailing through the strait in order to not disrupt the delicate balance of nature. At the beginning of the 20th century, a French engineer proposed a project of a bridge, but it was rejected because it was too complicated and costly. People also tried to develop a 23-mile-long tunnel, but this project also faced financial and technical difficulties. People are still dreaming of a bridge over the Strait of Gibraltar. Perhaps, in the future, when we develop cooler technologies, we'll be able to build this thing. Oh, by the way, there hasn't always been water between these two regions. In the distant past, the two continents were connected. The entire Mediterranean Sea is the remains of the Tethys Sea that existed before the era of dinosaurs. Then the African and Indian plates collided with the Eurasian one, and the Tethys Sea completely disappeared. In its place, a land bridge was formed that separated the Mediterranean Sea from the ocean. Without access to water, the sea dried up about 6 million years ago. But then, when the bridge came down, the water began to fill the dried-up pool. For tens of thousands of years, the narrow plate sank lower and lower, and the Mediterranean Sea eventually got its current water levels.
When you think of beaches, the first scary thing that pops into your head is probably sharks, right? Those poor guys have a bad rap as the big bullies of the ocean, but honestly, they have way fewer fatal run-ins than jellyfish, algae, and even sand. Every year, tons of people flock to the beach to soak up the sun and chill by the waves, but digging holes in the sand can actually be pretty risky. In February 2024, a tragic incident occurred when a 7-year-old girl got trapped after a roughly 5-foot deep hole she dug with her brother caved in on her. Despite efforts from bystanders to rescue her, help arrived too late. You might think digging in the sand is harmless, but deep holes can be a final exit trap. Sand is defined by its size, not by its material. Most beach sand is quartz, but tropical spots might have coral sand. The weight of the sand depends on what's mixed in. Pure quartz is pretty light, around 90 pounds per cubic foot dried out, while more mixed sands can get way heavier. When sand is wet, it holds its shape better, but when it dries out, it's a whole different story. If you dig a hole and then it dries, it's likely to collapse. The danger increases dramatically if someone is standing near the edge, adding weight and making it even more unstable. Once that sand starts falling in, it fills up all the air pockets, making it hard for anyone trapped inside to breathe. Rescuing a person from a sand collapse is tough. Sand is heavy and keeps collapsing, so rescuers need to move fast. Ideally, they've got about 3 to 5 minutes before the trapped person suffocates. If you ever get in such a situation, the advice is to expose the person's mouth so they can breathe while someone else digs them out. If you're heading to the beach, be smart about holes. The best rule is to never dig a hole deeper than the knees of the shortest person in your group. Also, it's a good idea to fill any holes after you're done playing. It's all too easy for someone to stumble into a forgotten pit, and even a shallow hole can cause injuries. From 1997 to 2007, those sand holes took 31 lives in the US, and that's just within 10 years. Remember I told you sharks are responsible for fewer lives? From 1997 to this day, in 27 years, 29 people in the US have met their early demise because of sharks. Hitting the beach only to find a bunch of algae? Total buzzkill! But while some algae are totally fine, even to munch on, others can bring serious health risks, even if you're just hanging next to them. Algal blooms, or red tides, happen when algae go on a wild growth spree. These blooms can release nasty toxins that are bad news for humans, fish, shellfish, and even birds. One of the most well-known algal blooms rolls around almost every summer on Florida's Gulf Coast, leading to shellfish that are no longer safe to munch on. Even the ones that aren't toxic can throw a wrench in the ecosystem. When all that algae eventually withers and breaks down, it uses up the oxygen in the water, leaving marine life gasping for air. Folks definitely need to steer clear of eating shellfish from areas hit by these toxic algal blooms. Back in 1990, 6 fishermen almost met a tragic end after scarfing down some steamed mussels they'd gathered near Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Swimming in those waters doesn't always pose a serious health risk, but it's still not recommended. Some people might experience skin irritation or itchy eyes. Also, make sure to steer clear of swimming near dead fish, since that's where harmful bacteria can hang out. If you start to feel weird after getting in the water, it's best to get out and rinse off with fresh water right away. You know, it's not always some specific thing that makes certain beaches risky. Sometimes, beaches themselves are just full of surprises. Take Eddy Bay or Mission Beach in Australia, for example. The chances are you'll have to share the sand with cassowaries, some of the most intimidating birds on the planet. Picture getting all set to relax and sunbathe, only to find these giant flightless birds hanging out nearby. They're like emus, but scarier. They can weigh over 160 pounds and might be a bit aggressive, so watch out. If those birds don't freak you out, then the black sand beaches of Kilauea might just do the trick. They sure look inviting, but these beaches are right next to one of the most active volcanoes in the world, Mount Kilauea, which has been erupting since 1983, pouring hot lava into the ocean. These hot waters are not a big deal compared to some Hawaiian beaches. If you ever want to take a dip at Hanakapiai Beach on Kauai's coast, reconsider that plan. The beach is infamous for its strong rip currents that can pull you out to sea in an instant. If you find yourself caught in one, the nearest safe shore is a daunting 6 miles away. Official records show at least 30 fatalities here, but a nearby sign reportedly tallies up to over 80. Rips are those strong currents that pull water out to the ocean, and they can quickly drag people and stuff away from the shallow water near the beach. Typically, they move at about 1 to 2 miles per hour, but they can speed up to 4 or 5 miles per hour, which is faster than the speed of some professional swimmers. These currents are especially fierce when the surf is big, but you should never underestimate any body of water. You can also find rips around river mouths, estuaries, and even near structures like piers and groins. They can be tricky to spot, but you might notice a patch of churning, choppy water on the ocean's surface that signals a rip current. Riptides aren't exclusive to some specific location. They can be found across the world. Playa Zapolite in Mexico, Australia's Fraser Island, and many more. Another water danger is shore break waves. Those are fierce waves that crash straight onto the beach, often right on the sand. Imagine the force of a car slamming down on your body. That's kind of what getting caught in a shore break feels like. Such waves can cause some gnarly injuries, particularly to your neck and spine, even if they don't look super huge. Hawaii is notorious for its intense shore breaks, especially spots like Keiki Beach, where surfers throw caution to the wind for a thrill. So, if you're hitting a Hawaiian beach, keep an eye on those insider waves and always look out for lifeguards. Getting stung by jellyfish is something that happens a lot to folks who are swimming, wading, or diving in the ocean. Those long tentacles can deliver venom through thousands of tiny, sharp stingers. However, to us humans, this venom doesn't do much. Yeah, it's very unpleasant. It gives us burning sensations and probably some skin redness. But that's mostly it. You won't even spot the stung area in a couple of days. Most jellyfish stings will heal up on their own in a few days or weeks with some at-home care, even though sometimes they can lead to something more dangerous with way more severe symptoms. However, if you're hanging out in the coastal waters of northern Australia and the Indo-Pacific region, and you get stung by a jellyfish, you're in for a lot of trouble, my friends. See, it's the area where box jellyfish live, and these jellies are no joke. Some people rightfully call them sea wasps or even marine stingers. They're probably the most hazardous and toxic jellyfish out there. Their sting is incredibly excruciating, so much so that some folks have experienced cardiac arrest before they even made it to the shore. Rumor has it, those jellies are responsible for taking nearly 80 lives in Australia since records started. So how do you tell who's who? Unlike regular jellies, box jellyfish got this pale blue see-through vibe. Also, they got their name because their bell-shaped body looks like a cube.
This tourist destination has the highest entrance price of all. It could cost you your life. Those who spend over 16 hours in the death zone, and it is the official name of the most dangerous area on Mount Everest, risk never returning home. Those who endure 48 hours there will almost certainly never see their families again. The altitude in this region is over 26,000 feet, and winds can reach speeds of 62 miles per hour, sweeping everything, including you, off their path. Only one person has stood tall in this hostile environment for 90 hours. There was a bit of cheating involved, as it was with supplemental oxygen. Yep, the precious O2 gas is extremely scarce there. Without this vital resource, the maximum time someone can survive is about 21 hours. A record set by this guy. Yeah, he was tough. He reached the Everest peak 10 times. His fastest ascent took slightly under 17 hours, but Pemba broke his record, ascending Everest in 8 hours and 10 minutes. However, these accomplishments are not feats for the average Joe. These record holders have, in a sense, won a genetic lottery. Both are Nepalese Sherpas, hence the names. Sherpas are native to the mountains and have evolved a natural resistance to high-altitude living. Despite the undeniable dangers, people seem unwilling to stop visiting the death zone. Since the establishment of climbing records, over 300 people have lost their lives there. Last year alone, 18 people perished, and as of July 2024, the death zone has claimed 8 lives. Now, as creepy as it may sound, the death zone on Mount Everest resembles a graveyard. The challenge lies in that of recovering a body from this perilous location costs families a fortune. Oxygen alone, which is necessary to descend a body, can amount to as much as 20 grand. This may seem far-fetched, but the operation requires 12 people, each needing an oxygen cylinder that costs around $400. So, do the math. And it's not just the oxygen. Imagine the other expenses summed up. Still, it's not only the money. The retrieval process is fraught with danger for those tasked with it, causing many private companies to decline such requests. Recently, authorities managed to recover 4 bodies and a skeleton from the treacherous area. While not all of them have been identified, one body belonged to an individual who passed away in 2017, remaining in the death zone for 7 years. El Caminito del Rey in Spain, Maluga, may look like child's play compared to Everest Death Zone, as reportedly it has only claimed 6 lives. But still, this is eerie. Imagine you're standing on an old piece of wood some people dare to call a walkway that seems to be about to fall apart. You can't really move freely on it, as it's just 3 feet wide, and if you look down, you'll see nothing but a river 330 feet below you. You may want to sarcastically call it an engineering wonder, but in reality, it really is. Look, it seems like this walkway was glued to the side of a cliff. The tools and technique used to build it were quite rudimentary and unsafe, which is not surprising. The pathway is over a century old. If you're wondering how it was built without any machinery we have today, let me explain. The poor builders just hung off the side of the mountain using ropes. It's obvious no one wanted to work on that project, so prisoners who had received the death penalty were invited to participate. In exchange, they could get a reduction in their sentences, if they made it out alive, of course. Now, originally the walkway was built to connect workers at the hydroelectric power plants by some local waterfalls. You know, just a little bridge to help them cross while transporting materials and keeping things in check at the channel. The construction kicked off in 1901 and wrapped up by 1905. The walkway was famously crossed by King Alfonso XIII in 1921 during the inauguration of a dam. This pathway has seen some rough times by the early 2000s and was partly closed for over a decade. 4 years of renovations and €9 million later, it burst back onto the scene in 2015. It has gained a reputation as the world's most dangerous walkway due to a couple of tragic accidents in the late 90s. Now, you can stroll along a 1.8-mile path that hugs the edge of the gorge. Hey, remember I told you this Caminito only took 6 lives? Forget it. Nobody knows how much it really was. Alright, the next cliff destination may seem totally safe at first glance, but it's all about a very particular activity performed there. It's definitely not as high up in the sky as El Caminito del Rey, only soaring 89 feet, but this cliff is meant to jump from, and people actually do that. Now, if you were to take a watermelon and give it a dramatic drop into the water below, you'd end up with a spectacular crimson splash of watermelon juice, looking like a crime scene. It would plummet at a wild speed of 53 miles per hour, and it begs the question, can a human handle that kind of dive? Spoiler alert, absolutely. Welcome to Red Bull cliff diving, where brave athletes take the plunge from heights equivalent to an 8-story building. But before you think about trying this for kicks, let me tell you, it takes serious fitness to pull it off. The better your shape is, the better your dive, but it's also all about your peepers. Your eyes become your ultimate navigation system as you make that fearless leap. Fearless? The impact is no joke. If you dare to jump, you'll feel around 5 g-force on impact. For comparison, when you're on a commercial flight, even during the craziest turbulence, you rarely feel more than 1.3 g-force. But when you dive from a cliff, your heart's working overtime, and that 5 g-force can leave you lightheaded in no time. Your brain starts to feel a bit oxygen-starved, and before you know it, you could black out in a few seconds. All that blood suddenly rushes to your head, your face puffs up, and your lower eyelids practically cover your eyes. This phenomenon is called red-out, because all you see is a bright glow through those squeezed-shut eyelids. Yeah, that sounds like fun. Now, unlike all those cliffs, this place is pretty accessible, and is popular among freedivers for having little current, which is good when you go in depth. However, despite all those seemingly nice aspects of the Blue Hole in Egypt, this place has taken around 200 lives in recent years. Now, to be honest, technically, the Blue Hole is a complete average dive spot. There's nothing extraordinary that would make it more dangerous than any other spot in the Red Sea. However, diving through the arch at the Blue Hole is no joke. It's a tricky submerged tunnel that has seen its fair share of accidents. While there's no official count of how many have lost their lives here, one source estimates that around 130 divers perished there between 1997 and 2012. That's more than 8 each year. Some say the number could be as high as 200, including a few snorkel-related accidents not tied to the arch dive. To help keep things safe, Egyptian authorities placed a police officer at the Blue Hole who makes sure divers are with certified guides who know the ropes. Now, the arch itself sits 170 feet down, which means you really need to know what you're doing and have the right gear, since recreational divers usually max out at around 100 feet or so. For experienced technical divers, it's mostly manageable. The real challenge is keeping track of your air in your tank, because if you mess up and take too long down there, you're going to need more than one tank of air to get through safely. If the gas isn't planned out right, you could find yourself short on air when you need to do your decompression stops, or even worse, you can run out of it completely. And, that would be bad. A tsunami hitting major cities on or near the Mediterranean Sea and in the northeastern part of the Atlantic Ocean is not a matter of if, but when. It is scary and surreal to think that places like Cannes or Barcelona could suddenly get slammed by a huge wave, but the fact is, European coastlines are in active tectonic areas. Only about 10% of all tsunamis worldwide happen in the Mediterranean, and there have been at least 290 tsunamis in this area since 1600, before Common Era. Despite the relatively low number, this phenomenon has caused numerous devastating disasters throughout Europe's history. Back in 1755, an estimated 8.5 magnitude earthquake with an epicenter southwest of Cape St. Vincent triggered a tsunami that destroyed most of Lisbon, the capital of Portugal. About 40 minutes after the earthquake, this massive wave just slammed into the harbor in downtown, racing up the Tagus River. The phenomenon was so fast that several people on horseback had to gallop to higher ground to avoid getting carried away. And this was just the beginning of a nightmare, with 2 more terrifying waves hitting Lisbon right after. A disaster like this is similar to what we see in the Pacific Ocean several times a century, but in the Atlantic, it's very rare. This type of major tsunami is expected to happen every 3 to 5 centuries, but now it could happen tomorrow. Marseille in France, Chipion in Spain, and other cities are on the list of important locations that could be flooded soon, with a roughly 100% chance of being hit by a tsunami in the next 30 years. Statistics show that the wave will probably be more than 3 feet high. I know, it doesn't sound like much, especially since when we think about tsunamis, we imagine terrifyingly tall waves, like the one that hit Lituya Bay in Alaska. In that case, the wave was over 1,700 feet tall. But we must remember that even waves only 19 inches high can be dangerous to swimmers, because it's not the height of the tsunami that matters, but also the flow and movement of the water. Not to mention the flooding, which can damage beaches, harbors, and streets. If the coastline has a small harbor and the waterfront is exceptionally low, like Cannes, this natural disaster might be much more dangerous. Tsunamis around 6 feet high can lift cars off the ground, while smaller waves can create walls of water traveling at 40 miles per hour. Plus, there are these smaller events that might not wreck everything, but still can cost a ton of money. For example, large sandbars that move around on the ocean floor, like sand dunes shifting in deserts. They can mess up pipelines or deep-sea cables for internet and communications, and that ends up costing businesses and governments millions of dollars. That's why organizations like UNESCO are worried about the possibility of a dangerous tsunami hitting Europe soon. So they're doing everything they can to prevent apocalyptic scenarios, like what happened in 2004 when an earthquake off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia, caused waves over 100 feet high in coastal communities, resulting in over 200,000 lives lost. And let's not forget about 2011, when an earthquake off the coast of Tohoku, Japan, triggered a tsunami that reached about 6 miles inland and caused a major nuclear accident at a power station along the coast. Over 16,000 people lost their lives in that tragedy, and the event resulted in billions of dollars in infrastructure damage. These disasters were huge wake-up calls, and we've come a long way since 2004. We're much safer today, largely because the tsunami warning system is highly effective at quickly detecting this dangerous situation. Unlike many other natural phenomena, a tsunami can be anticipated. We may only have a few minutes to act, but if we all know what to do, many lives can be saved. And in most parts of the world, sirens are commonly used to alert people to tsunamis. To sound the siren as early as possible, initial tsunami alerts usually rely only on seismic data. First, specialists receive information about an earthquake. Seismic waves travel about 100 times faster than tsunamis, so they have enough time to analyze the data and see if the earthquake might have generated a tsunami and whether they should issue an initial tsunami alert. At U.S. warning centers, for example, scientists typically issue initial alerts within 5 minutes of an earthquake. If a tsunami is suspected, these alerts may also include information about wave arrival times, recommended actions, and potential impacts. But sounding the alarm is not enough. To save lives, coastal communities also need to be trained to respond fast and in the best way possible. That's why UNESCO produced this program called Tsunami Ready, aiming to train people living in coastal areas at risk on how to act in case of a tsunami event by the year 2030. The idea is to help communities stay safe by teaching them how to protect their livelihoods and safeguard their homes. Being recognized as tsunami ready by UNESCO doesn't mean a community is tsunami proof, of course. It's more like a recognition that they have adopted all possible measures to mitigate tsunami risks. So authorities are helping communities to prepare themselves by installing evacuation signs, establishing security procedures, and creating plans to warn tourists. Like Spain, which distributed tsunami warning signs along the entire coastline, as well as signs showing evacuation routes to higher ground. And Spain better be prepared. I mean, only 7 tsunamis have hit the country since the year 365, so it's difficult to predict the effects of such an event. But they could be devastating, considering that Spanish coastal areas are so economically important. There's also a danger zone in the Averroes Fault beneath the Barents Sea. If an earthquake happens at this point, people will have only 21 minutes to escape a tsunami. UNESCO has also established 12 tsunami warning centers, which cover Europe as well. This initiative involves 5 centers located in the Mediterranean and Northeast Atlantic regions. These centers can save thousands of lives because they monitor ocean disturbances 24/7. Then, after analyzing the threat, they send out messages based on the event's potential to cause a tsunami. The intensity scale ranges from no effect to completely devastating. And by that, they understand that nearly all brick buildings could be demolished by waves, and even the most reinforced concrete structures could suffer heavy damage. Now, so far, we have mostly talked about tsunamis caused by earthquakes along converging tectonic plate boundaries. In fact, earthquakes have accounted for over 80% of tsunamis since 1900. But tsunamis can also result from landslides, volcanic eruptions, and even meteorite impacts. Experts are also worried that with the current changes in climate, we might see more of meteotsunamis popping up in the Mediterranean. These ones are triggered by freaky weather conditions and can mess with any coastline that's got a shallow seafloor. They might not be as huge or famous as the earthquakes ones, but they can still cause significant property damage and put people in danger. For instance, in 2006, a meteotsunami struck the harbor of Ciutadella on the Spanish island of Menorca. Yachts were tossed into each other and later stranded on the harbor floor as the water receded, resulting in tens of millions of euros in damage. Unfortunately, meteotsunamis in the Mediterranean tend to be stronger during summer, so if you're planning to spend your vacation in Europe, stay alert for any signs of dangerous waves. If you suddenly encounter a tsunami moving in your direction, remember this is the time to react. Move to higher ground as far inland as possible. Pay special attention to any emergency alerts and information, and follow the guidance of local authorities. Most importantly, do not wait around taking photos. Leave the area as soon as you notice any signs of this danger event, or if you hear an official tsunami warning. Hey, stay safe. There's a mysterious island that appears and disappears like magic. Just like Schrödinger's cat, this Schrödinger's island exists and doesn't exist at the same time. Officially, it's called Sandy Island, and it once appeared in maps, but it was never there in real life. Australian scientists decided to solve the mystery once and for all by embarking on an adventure to find this elusive archipelago. But when they reached the coordinates, all they found was endless blue waves. It's like the island was playing a game of hide-and-seek with them. This story goes back to 1876. A whaling ship was crossing the area and reported an island. Whoever saw it said it was over 15 miles long north to south and around 3 miles wide, about the size of Manhattan, so not so tiny at all. But every time researchers went to visit the area, they found nothing. So in 1974, an official mission from New Caledonia declared that Sandy Island was simply not a thing and excluded it from all maps. People went on with their lives until they noticed that the island was appearing on Google Earth as a black blob. In 2012, another Australian expedition went out to check out the area to get some explanations. They had to write a eulogy for the long-lost island and explain what could have created this mess. For starters, mapping technology wasn't at its peak back in the 1900s. It was easy to get the coordinates wrong. Then there was the fact that the area is big on volcanic activities. It's likely that volcanic lava cooled down and created a raft of some kind. Let's say that the whaling ship went by, saw the volcanic raft, and thought it was land from a distance. But hey, it's just a guess. Humans have ventured far and wide across the globe, and it may have seemed at some point that we discovered each and every nook of our planet. But when Mount Lico popped up on Google Earth, scientists were overcome with excitement. This hidden gem in northern Mozambique is no ordinary rainforest. It's nestled inside a volcano. Determined to confirm the existence of this mysterious forest, experts assembled a team of top-notch scientists and specialists from around the world. The journey to Mount Lico was no walk in the park, with a daunting vertical rock climb standing between them and the forest. But after 6 years of planning and preparation, they were ready for the challenge. Once they got there, they saw it was even better than they imagined. The place was like a perfectly tended garden. The forest sounded unique and different from other rainforests. There were some insanely huge caterpillars that looked dangerous. And they even found ancient pots and evidence of an untouched human ecosystem. Ooh. Terra incognita means unknown land. And one of the largest unknown territories being uncovered today is the land beneath Antarctica's ice sheets. Below the snowy surface, there is an entirely new world of canyons, waterways, and lakes, which are now being mapped. One can't help but wonder, is there really liquid water below Antarctica's frozen surface? Yep. Water can exist without freezing due to pressure. The liquid water is the result of Earth's warm interior, and that's how we get things such as Lake Vostok. Now, you can't see it, but Lake Vostok is right here. Located in East Antarctica, it lies beneath 2.5 miles of thick ice. This huge lake is about 4,800 square miles. Humans could only discover it with the help of some top-notch technologies like seismic soundings and ice-penetrating radars. According to these scientists, it's likely that the lake has been there for up to 15 million years. Bhutan is on the map for, among other things, being the happiest country in all of Asia. But it kept a hidden gem for all these years, one of the world's tallest unclimbed mountains, Kunkar Pansum. Bhutan is enmeshed in the glorious Himalayan mountains. That's why the climbing community was beyond excited when they discovered an untouched mountain. Imagine being the first person to climb an unexplored peak. That would probably guarantee you a spot in the Guinness World Records for sure. The mountain has been untouched because of a Bhutanese law. For locals, the mountain peak is a sacred site, shrouded in mystery and legends. One of their beliefs is that the sacredness of climbing a mountain lies not in reaching its peak, but in truly communing with the mountain and enjoying the process. We got to admit, that is a bit of a newsflash for Westerners. If you're ever in the state of New York, make sure you check out the Aglo General Store. You'll have to drive somewhere around the Catskills to find a beautiful, grand, big nothing. Aglo is one of America's most famous paper towns, aka a fake town. But this case is different from Sandy Island. Aglo Town never existed, and it wasn't a mistake. You see, there's an old copyright practice amongst map makers. They add in paper towns so they can know when someone is simply copy-pasting their work. What they didn't expect is that this would get completely out of hand. Some say that one day a guy picked up a map at a gas station that had Aglo Town marked in it. The person decided to open a store over there and named it Aglo General Store. Some say the guy who opened the store faced a lawsuit from the map makers. Anyways, it only lasted enough years to become a national joke. Americans drove from all over the U.S. to get a picture of the town's fake welcome sign. And then we've got Bermeja Island, located in the Gulf of Mexico. This funky island appeared on many maps of the 16th and 17th centuries. It was probably drawn by Spanish explorers. Sure, the exact location varied from map to map, and its name sometimes appeared as Bermeja, but its existence was certain enough. The Bermeja Island was last seen in a 1921 Mexican map, and then, poof, it dropped out of the horizon altogether. People started talking and wondering, did the island sink? Was it destroyed? In 2009, 3 official investigations happened to search for the island. They used high-tech technologies to scour the Mexican seabed, but Bermeja was nowhere. Researchers had multiple guesses on what it could be. Let's delve on one of these ideas. The idea was probably made up by old-day explorers to mislead their enemies in search of land and gold. Well, that seems plausible. Now, let's take a look at Rio de Janeiro. Once, the city was filled with informal territories. These places are known as slums or favelas. They're like mini-cities inside the big city. Some favelas are known to be underprivileged territories, where dwellers don't get the same urban perks as other citizens, such as the sewage system and garbage pickups. These slums grew so quickly that the government didn't have time to keep track of their developments. So today, it's usually the dwellers themselves that name the streets and make do with whatever they have at their disposal. One of the biggest slums in Brazil is located in Rio de Janeiro, the so-called Hacienda, and it was only recognized as a neighborhood by the local government in the 1990s. Our own ocean floor is less mapped than Venus, Mars, and the Moon. In fact, 95% of our oceans are unexplored. Strange, right? We do have the available technology, which is mainly sonar soundings, sending wave sounds to the ocean bed and registering what they hear back. One of the main advantages of mapping the seabed more thoroughly would be to get more insight to marine hazards such as earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. Plus, there are so many unidentified marine life. This could give us a great insight into preservation and discovering the true dynamics of our marine ecosystems.
Humans are at the top of the food chain, but despite this, some creatures cause us a lot of trouble, and we can't do anything about them. Look at these flies with red eyes and blue-green bodies. These are some farmers' worst nightmare in the United States of America. Meet the New World screwworm flies. These little troublemakers have been munching on livestock from Florida to California for centuries, racking up some serious damage to the agricultural scene. To combat these pesky flies, the U.S. Department of Agriculture dropped a whopping 15 million sterile screwworm larvae from helicopters along the Panama-Colombia border. There's even a factory in Panama cranking out these sterile larvae like it's factory-fresh fruit. This action sounds weird, but it makes a lot of sense. The thing is, female flies only get one shot at mating in their entire lives. So if they happen to mate with a sterile dude, that's it. No offspring, ever. This clever trick means healthy screwworms can't reproduce when surrounded by sterile pals, which keeps their numbers in check. But how do we make these male flies sterile in the first place? Simple. A little radiation zap does the trick. You throw a bunch of flies in a lab, give them a quick spin through an X-ray machine, and then drop them from a helicopter into the wild, where their relatives are hanging out. If screwworms start making a comeback, inspectors hop on ATVs and cruise thousands of miles to hunt down any infected animals and stop the spread. There's no magic trick to wipe out these parasites completely, but the game plan is clear. Keep the sterile fly drops coming and stay one step ahead of these pesky little critters. Do you know why it's too dangerous to move animals from one habitat to another? There's a possibility that they won't encounter predators in the new area and will become an invasive species that will provoke an ecological disaster. Here's a simple example. In the 30s in the 20th century, farmers from Australia faced a serious problem. Cane beetles were spoiling sugarcane in the northern part of the country. Insects devoured a huge amount of the harvest, and people couldn't stop it. They didn't want to spoil the cane with poisonous pesticides, so they brought a group of cane toads from South America in the hope that the toads would eat the pests. But when these toads found themselves in the reed fields, they couldn't reach the bugs, as they lived on tall reeds. The toads just couldn't jump at such height and get the pests. So instead of beetles, they began to eat other insects. Amphibians started multiplying at a tremendous rate. The female cane toad can lay about 30,000 eggs at a time. After 3 days, small tadpoles hatch from the eggs. They swim in the water for 20 weeks and then turn into grown-up toads that live from 5 to 10 years. Millions of jumping animals began taking over the entire northern part of the continent, destroying all the biodiversity around. Leaves, grass, insects, carrion. Toads ate all this and didn't leave food for other animals. The problem was that the toads turned out to be very hardy creatures. Heat, cold, rain, droughts, they can breed anywhere and nothing can stop them. But what about other animals? Australia is full of alligators, big birds, and other creatures that would love to feast on croaking amphibians. Yes, it's true. But any animal that tried to eat these toads didn't survive. The problem is that cane toads are venomous. There are special glands behind their eyes that produce strong toxins that cause serious health problems in any animal. Some farmers saw birds falling from the sky after they had swallowed these amphibians. More than 80 years have passed since farmers brought 100 cane toads to Australia. Now, there are about 1.5 billion of them. They have already covered 386,000 square miles, which is about the same area as the states of Texas and Oklahoma combined. And so far, scientists and biologists haven't come up with an effective way to deal with them. People tried to catch them, but it was useless. Even if you catch 98 toads out of 100 next to a small pond, the 2 remaining toads can produce 30,000 eggs per night. Nature may be able to restore balance when some animals with immunity to toad toxins appear in Australia. But at the moment, cane toads are unstoppable. How can we stop the uncontrolled population of mosquitoes that are dangerous to humans? The correct answer is to create 735 million genetically modified mosquitoes and mix these two groups. All over the world, Many species of mosquitoes carry infections that cause serious health problems to humans. Almost no one likes mosquitoes. These buzzing insects prevent us from sleeping, and their bites are incredibly itchy. Many people would probably be happy if these creatures disappeared from the face of the earth. And scientists might have found a way to make this wish come true. Only female mosquitoes bite us because they need food to produce eggs. So, scientists released genetically modified male mosquitoes with a special protein in their bodies. After two mosquitoes come into contact, this protein is transmitted from the male to the female and then prevents it from producing offspring. All this happens before the age when females begin to bite. So, females can't create offspring, which means they don't need to bite people and animals anymore. And the more of such proteins scientists spread, the smaller the mosquito population will be. It sounds good, but about 240,000 people have signed a petition to cancel this experiment. Many scientists believe that the disappearance of one insect species can lead to a biological catastrophe. Nature is a complex, balanced system where the slightest change can lead to serious problems. Mosquitoes are a food source for many reptiles and amphibians. The extinction of mosquitoes can trigger the disappearance of many species. It's like a chain reaction of catastrophes, the end of which is unknown. Nevertheless, modified mosquitoes have already been released in Florida, and it seems that nothing terrible has happened. The good news is that people have fewer health problems after that. Moreover, since 2019, about 1.5 billion mosquitoes have been released worldwide. It has saved millions of lives and hasn't disrupted the delicate balance of nature yet. Recently, scientists have released another group of safe mosquitoes in East Africa. Well, let's hope that scientists have everything under control. Invasive species are not always mosquitoes, flies, or amphibians. These can also be large animals, such as feral pigs or super pigs. These pigs are a mix of domestic swine and wild boar. There are already almost 7 million feral hogs in the south of the USA. Thanks to people's efforts, these animals haven't spread to the north yet. But the danger to the northern states comes from Canada. Pigs were brought there in the 80s to support agriculture. But in the early 2000s, wild boars lost their popularity. They just stayed in the wild, and farmers were sure that those animals wouldn't survive the harsh Canadian winter. Oh, how wrong they were. Wild pigs turned out to be hardy, mobile, and capable of rapid reproduction. These animals dig and tear up the ground, eat almost everything they come across, and thus, take food from other animals. By the way, other creatures can become their lunch too. Wild pigs attack mice, geese, ducks, and some species of deer. They trample crops, grass, and flowers and are not afraid of anything. They're like natural bulldozers. Any farm is in danger of extinction if it's in the path of thousands of super pigs. And people can't do anything with them. The northern states understand that an invasion is imminent, so they're preparing for a long battle. Super pigs love swampy areas with tall grass. Canadian and American farmers will try to drive them into more open areas and fence those places off. The plan is not perfect, but it can slow the pigs down and save some time.
Would you like a professional stylist to fold your luggage, a private chef to cook meals just for you, and an entire plane to transport your TV set that didn't fit in your private jet? That's pretty much the everyday travel reality for the top 0.1% of U.S. earners who made around $3 million per year in 2022. Compare that to the regular salary of a working American of around $60,000. And then there's the top 1% who made around $800,000 the same year. If you want to travel like the richest people in the world, forget about chilling at one luxury hotel with shampoo made of gold for 2 weeks. The latest trend in upscale traveling is surf and turf. Rich guests spend a week on a sleek yacht after staying at a luxury hotel, or the other way around. Boat sales have surged in recent years, And the rich love to charter sailboats for $25,000 a week to as much as $90,000. It's a great way to get away from the common folk, you know. Everything is pre-planned by their travel agents, so they don't have to worry about a thing. The ultra-wealthy can often opt for private islands or buy out entire hotels. For instance, a villa on a private island off the Cannes coast in France will cost you around $290,000 a week. It's in high demand, a reasonable price to pay for the absence of neighbors or traffic. And if you do miss the hustle and bustle at some point, you can always hop on a speedboat and dance the night away at one of the luxurious beach clubs. In 2023, Greece became the top destination for the richest 1% of travelers. Paros Island was the most mentioned new favorite. Italian Sicily lost its charm to them because it's overvisited by the White Lotus fans. And it's not just about the Four Seasons-operated San Domenico Palace, where the show is based, but the entire island. For winter fun, there's always Aspen and ski towns in the European wonderland, like Switzerland and France. They have exclusive hotels, Michelin-starred restaurants, high-end shops, and chalets that look richer and more luxurious than an average family house. If there's no natural snow, the artificial snow system solves the problem. Some of the best hotels have direct access to lifts that take guests to the main skiing slopes. For those who aren't fans of the European resorts, there are always the Seychelles, where you can rent a villa for about $11,000 per night at a private island resort. George and Amal Clooney like to come here. Those who don't find it cool or exclusive enough go to Antarctica by private jet from Cape Town. The trip that lasts less than 24 hours costs $195,000. Richard Branson prefers to take his vacations to a private Necker Island, is part of the British Virgin Islands, and has some beautiful wildlife around it to explore. Guests rent the whole place for $80,000 per night. There's enough room for 34 people, but not all billionaires like to share, you know. People who are among the world's richest like to be at events where they can meet like-fortuned ones. Events like the World Economic Forum in Davos, where a standard steak will cost you $150 and a drink will be $40. Then there are horse races, Miami or Singapore yacht shows, or Dubai International Boat Show. For those who love movies or showing off their lavish dresses, the Sundance Film Festival in Utah, the Cannes Film Festival in France, or Venice International Film Festival in Italy could be good options. Sports lovers travel to events like the US Open Golf Tournament and other golf cups, the Wimbledon Tennis Tournament in the UK, the Melbourne Cup in Australia, or the Monaco Grand Prix for those who love speed and expensive cars. Those who can't live without style and like to be trendsetters don't miss fashion weeks in New York, London, Milan, and Paris. For music and crazy luxurious building lovers, there are always opera balls, like the one in Vienna, Austria, or La Scala Opera House opening night in Milan, Italy. And then, of course, there are special events like birthdays. When she was turning 22, billionaire Kylie Jenner rented a super yacht for over $1 million per week. An average person would have to save up for years to rent this vessel, even for one day. Okie dokie, so they need to find a way to get to their deluxe point B, right? Well, more and more people opt for private jets. You can fly at any time, even during restrictions on commercial air travel, to any place. And you won't have to choose between chicken or pasta when the flight attendant finally reaches your seat, 35D. There are around 22,000 business aircraft worldwide, and the number is only going up. Most of these jets are in the US, and Brazil takes the second place. Germany is the leader in Europe and only ranks 5th on the global list. Now, if for some reason they aren't traveling to their destination by a private jet and decide to share first class with other passengers, they'll at least need to ship their luggage instead of taking it on the plane with them. The luggage of the wealthy gets picked up from their door and awaits them at the luxurious suite or yacht on the other side of the journey. And if they want it to be done within one day, they need to pay hundreds of dollars for one bag. By the way, you don't expect them to pack their bags all by themselves, do you? It's much easier to hire someone for thousands of dollars to go through all that trouble. A professional stylist picks all the clothes that will look picture perfect and then rolls the items, puts them in bags, and makes lists of what's inside and what goes with what. The clothes aren't included in the stylist compensation, of course, so they add another 1,000 or 10 to the vacation grand total. Although the ultra-rich travelers can afford to rent any car while traveling, not all of them like to sit in a vehicle that belongs to someone else. That's why they choose to ship their own luxurious cars to their destination. It costs around $36,000 to fly a Porsche from Dubai to London with Emirates. It's enough money to buy a brand new family hatchback in the UK, but most billionaires don't like this type of vehicle. Some wealthy travelers don't trust commercial airlines and prefer to charter a cargo plane to transport their vehicles. Sometimes they take a whole bunch of cars, motorbikes, and other expensive toys. Covered trucks in the country of destination transport all this beauty to the client's address or a garage of their choice. Owners don't like stranger delivery drivers to add miles to their shiny vehicles. This whole delivery service costs several millions. Some cars have only sentimental value for their own and are worth way less than their deluxe delivery. One really well-off man even hired a cargo plane for his Samsung TV that couldn't fit through the door of his jet. Oh, rich people's problems. They can afford to eat at any restaurant in the world, but it would be too mainstream, so they prefer to bring their private chefs on vacation. These professional cooks know their clients' diets and health goals. For luxury travelers, consistency and routine are too important to trade them for public restaurants. For chefs, it's often a chance to travel for free and get a good salary at the same time. Sometimes the clients will even fly the family of the chef with them if traveling happens over the holidays. This job has high demands and can be really stressful with varied working hours. Sometimes they have to spontaneously cook dinners for 16 people or find rare ingredients at locations with basic grocery stores. And of course, everything they overhear during meals must remain a top secret.